Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Seeking Harmony series. We are today looking at some of the topics that have been newsworthy to us over the last week and just trying to understand what's lying at the core of those stories and get to the truth of what we are observing in the news at the moment. So I'd like to open it up to the team to see which topic they feel was really the standout one, and we will kick off our conversation with that topic.
Well, I definitely feel that the main topic for tonight was Iran. I don't know how you guys feel about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so okay. So yeah, basically for the past week, we've seen like an uprising of protests in Iran and kind of a repression from the government, and then an uprising of protests all around the world for Iran. And yeah, it all started with the passing of Mahsa Amini, who was a woman who died in custody, basically, at the hands of the police. And it just like revealed what a lot of Iranians knew about it, but that in custody you can be tortured and raped and die, basically, especially when you're a woman. And yeah, just to have a little bit of background, Iran was, for the longest time, even though like the situation in that region was difficult, it was a very like high cultural point, and where women had freedom of dressing, like there were different like way of like wearing the hijab, and they could do arts and things like that. And then there was like the dictatorship, and yeah, things just got harder. And now it's to a point where the Islamic law forbids them to sing or to dress in a certain way. And so it's just very hard on them. I think what the protest is like outlining is that hardship that they have suffered in the past few years, and the, I guess, decrease of their freedom. So yeah, I don't know how much you guys know about that and what you want to discuss about that, but yeah, I'm curious about like what would you would like to say basically about the situation.
Yeah, I think what stood out to me is that the protesters, some of them are like shouting or chanting or like repeating, we don't want an Islamic Republic. And I feel like, that is something to unpack because, the truth of it is that Islam itself, like as a religion or as like maybe something that people engage in terms of how they live their lives, in terms of like how society is or something as part of your life. Like Islam itself isn't really what's mainly being protested. And like the fact that they say that doesn't necessarily mean that the core issue is with Islam itself. I feel like the core issue is with the government controlling Islam and using it as a weapon. Like they're weaponizing it. And they're using it as a way to control and exert exert control and to have a false power, have a false authority. And I feel like it's just that illusion is crumbling away, and maybe like years of this maybe fear or whatever impositions by the leaders in the government have put on people, like saying like, oh, you know, this is God's law, this is Islam, you know, if you defy this, that's terrible, you know, because it's tied to religion. The government is tied to religion. I think people are saying that they don't want that, or that the government shouldn't be so influential in seeing like what, you know, Muslims or like a good Muslim according to them should do, you know. And I think that is the core issue. And I think some people just feel even that like the government claims to represent Islam, but they don't. They don't. They just represent, you know, their own interests, basically. So, yeah, that's what I felt from it. And yeah, I felt that it was important to say because sometimes, like, I feel like in being in the United States and seeing like news from around the world in the West, like some viewpoints try to frame the problem as being Islam itself, which is just a really like obviously ignorant way to see it. It's like ignorance of what Islam is, but I feel like it's needed to say that so that the narrative, I don't know, is countered if people claim that that is what's happening. Yeah. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, so I think both of you have raised some important points, and I think it's a good idea to draw the distinction about how people are experiencing the rule of supposedly Islamic governments versus the religion of Islam, as it were, because I feel like and there might be just that level of misunderstanding that we perceive it as a religion of extremism, but at the core of it, there are very many teachings that do not subscribe to the extremism, but it's like the extremism has been publicized quite a bit, which makes the religion actually seem and sound bad in comparison to what we would generally accept as a more free, more liberal religion that allows for people to worship in a way that is comfortable and peaceful to them. And so I feel like we just need to, it was a good thing to just draw draw attention to the fact that there may be extremes perpetrated by Islamic states or factions with Islam that is not necessarily what the religion stands for or is based on. But also then to draw attention to the fact that there may be within the Islamic religion the extremes of abuse towards people that stand up against that kind of tyrannical abuse of the religion. And also, I think just the further extreme that it seems that where those extremes prevail, women's rights are much more abused. It almost to the extent of the sense that they don't necessarily have a voice of their own, where the extremism does take place. And this is why there's the potential for abuse, there's the potential for death in custody of the police, who would probably in certain instances be the instrument of the Islamic State and the instrument of that religious zeal that fuels the extremism. So I think there's a lot to unpack in terms of the fact that surface, we might not understand the complete dynamics of the religion, and because of that, it's open to abuse. But then also the fact that there are instances where it is abused to the extreme that human life is no longer respected, which for me feels a bit like it can't be the intention of a religion then. If human life is not sacred within a religion, then what is really the intention of the religion? And I think we always need to ask ourselves that question, like what does the religion stand for that allows the abuse of fundamental human rights, or what we would see as fundamental human rights? So yeah, I think we do need to be careful of what we're seeing play out in the media, what we've been taught to accept or not accept about certain components of various religions. And again, to ask the question, like, well, what is the truth here? Well, what is really happening here? And also, what should be happening here? Because it's important in this world to start to understand, well, if we're saying that this shouldn't be happening, then we need to also go to the flip side of the coin and go, well, what should be happening? What would we like to see? What are we trying to call in respect of our relationship with life, in respect of our relationship with religion, in respect of our relationship with each other?
Yeah, I think to answer, what came to me when you asked the question, what is the truth here? Obviously, it's pretty obvious that, the people are choosing to take their power back. But I also think it's like a choice to realign with their core values, which are actually the values of the religion. But the government is just not upholding those values, and they might be saying they are, but it is definitely not in alignment with the core values of the religion and of the people. Because if it were, then the people would be in agreement, but there's a horrible abuse going on.
Yeah, and I feel like in terms of the value of the religion and the core values of the religion, like what that can be for a religion can change dramatically based on how people interpret it, or like what parts people choose to highlight, like cherry pick out, and what parts people kind of ignore, and I think I was reading some articles last night, and it was saying, like, there's a part in the Quran that says women should wear these head coverings, like should wear hijab or something with at least that kind of coverage, because they might want to avoid being harassed by men who they aren't related to, or by anyone other than their husband. And I was like, well, yeah, like that's true, and that's more aligned with like women's empowerment, perhaps. Like you might want to do that, especially at the time when the Quran was written. Maybe in that context that made sense, and that is like empowering for women, you know what I mean? And I feel like we need to consider that too. I think that people are probably like reconsidering, well, they probably long have thought differently about Islam and what the religion stands for, right, than what the government does. And those who like benefit from the government directly, like there's probably been a gap there for a long time. And there is just like fear of standing against it, or fear of rebellion and stuff like that, until people started to find ways around it and, be more, grow in their determination and their courage, and share with each other, like saying like, hey, I don't agree with this. I don't agree with this government policy. I don't either. And the internet really made that possible, which is awesome. you know, where otherwise it would be very hard. Yeah.
I'm glad that you're bringing that up because, yeah, first of all, it was written at a time like that part of the Quran where maybe it was needed to be less harassed. And it was a time where in the Middle East, everyone, Jews and Christians, were wearing something over their head. Women were wearing something over their head as a sign of respect. And so, yeah, and that's something that is still integrated into like the most traditional parts of the church, and for nuns and things like that, you know. So there's an interpretation there, and also like what I understand of Islam from having friends that follow the Quran is that it's a set of advice more than a law, you know. It's more of a set of advice, and you do the best you can with who you are and what you want to do in life, and that's a guidance, you know. So it's so free, it's so much more free than what a lot of people would understand of Islam if they're not, you know, if they don't follow that religion. And so I think what the people are protesting there is that Islam, as it is a set of advice or guidance, shouldn't be the law of a government. Like they don't agree with that at all, because this is not the place for Islam to exist. And so I feel that's what they are saying, and even more so when the government applies it with a penal code so harsh that innocent people are dying just because they're not wearing the hijab right, just like a few centimeters away from the forehead, you know. So yeah, I think it's important to remember that, and I think what Muslims all over the world have been achieving in the past few years is that misunderstanding of their religion. But if you really take the time to look at it, like there is that misunderstanding in every religion. Like, you know, for example, the abuse of Indian American people in North America. A lot of Christians would agree that it's not how they see that religion. And the intolerance that we can see in Christianity, like, for example, my family would agree, but they don't agree with that, and they're still Christian, you know? So, meaning, you know, I think it's a lesson for the West to not vilify someone for their religion, because religion at the core, like every religion, it's what we learn with unionism, is love. It's the same message. But to really be understanding of, let's say, the miscommunications and the misunderstanding that there is in every relationship to religion from the people, and that we have to heal from it, wherever we come from, whether we follow like Islam, or if we are Christian or Buddhist or things like that, you know. And I loved what Isaiah said also about like people like claiming their power, because I feel like if we go down to the core, and I feel like God's meaning is probably for people to reclaim their power there, and reclaim their peace from, you know, the misunderstandings and sufferings that they had for so many years, and that it's their challenge, and that we're supporting them, of course. But like, yeah, it's it's not a joyous situation, but it's joyous to see like our brothers and sisters like fighting for what they believe, like all around the world, you know, and that there is no status quo about the situation in Iran. Yeah, I don't know how you guys feel about that.
So there's a part of me that almost wants to ask the question, why it is that people are now starting to stand up to this abuse of their rights and that kind of thing. But then there's also the other part that wants to just kind of also look at that sense of misinterpretation of some of the religious rites and rituals that have always been there and have always been implemented to one extent or another. And just, you know, in terms of the simplicity of the concept of head covering has been something that's been prevalent in the Catholic religion for a long time. It's been prevalent in the Jewish religion for a long time, for different reasons and to different extents. So, for instance, with Catholics, the head covering is a concept of, as you enter a church, and it's a sign of a respect to God. And it's not enforced as an absolute must. Whereas in certain Jewish faiths, there's the head covering that's an absolute enforced process for the fact that it's actually respecting your husband. And so men that you are not married to shouldn't see your natural hair. And then you have this concept of within Islam that it may have been a choice in terms of a day and age where you might have wanted to avoid being harassed as a woman. And so I feel like that there's a lot of work to be done to potentially understand the intention behind these rites and rituals in religion. But having said that, it must also not detract from the fact that it still doesn't, for me, give the level of carte blanche to the abuse of anybody within a religion that we have seen in the past. It doesn't also give carte blanche to the extremism that we've seen in relation to certain religions that would allow or even just pave the way for Western people, not Western people, people that are not part of a type of religion, to actually vilify a religion. We have seen religious wars fought over many years for the fact that people felt that certain religions were more sacrosanct and more respected than others. We also know historically that the Catholic Church has been in the past one of the biggest proponents of war. So, you know, and yet you don't see the Catholic faith vilified. So we also have to draw the distinction of where was the narrative controlled? Who was controlling the narrative? What purpose did it serve to control the narrative and then vilify religions that were, for all intents and purposes, seen as smaller, upstart religions at some point in our history? And when I say history, I'm talking about the history of humanity. It's not necessarily our history, but there's always been these religious wars and this religious figure that has played out across many years. And the core of it has always been this clash of wills, this battle for supremacy. then we also need to understand is why certain religions have been vilified and why there's still that popular narrative of certain parts of those religions as the villain.
I want to go back a little bit to what you said about like, you know, the intention behind like covering your head does not justify the level of violence that we've seen. And yeah, what I wanted to say is that in a sense, it's almost like abortion, you know, because like at the core, it's the choice of the woman, and the woman should be like the one who chooses for herself always. And so isn't that the same to vilify her if she chooses an abortion than to vilify her because of the way she dresses? And in a sense, like we are all fighting, you know, the same evil. It's, you know, ego, but in a different way. And so, yeah, we vilify the others, or the way a government treats its people and things like that. And we don't understand others' religion. But like, it's just a means for separation. And so if we go deeper, we know that it's all the same. And it's not about like skin color or beliefs or being better than the other. Like we are all healing literally the same things. Like the misunderstandings of the interpretations of the sacred text, and the freedom to choose, and the freedom to love others, not do harm to others. It's all the same all the time, you know. And so I think for me, it's not even a question of trying to ask, like, what is the origin of this thing, and why has this been this way? I think in a sense, yes, it's like always interesting. And I'm always interested in like knowing the history of things, but there is just sometimes a sense that we just have to, yeah, let go of the bullshit. And maybe we think it's complicated because we're not Muslim or we don't come from the Middle East, but it actually isn't. Like the message is very clear, and that's why the protests have been gaining momentum all throughout the world, not just because Iran is in a dire situation and that the government is trying to cut all communications and all social media. It's just like the message is very simple, like freedom is love, and people shouldn't have to fight for their freedom. It should be a given. So again, like where there is like this kind of situations where how huge boundaries and huge responses needed. And I think that's the most important thing that we can like, you know, remember from this situation and keep in our hearts, because like, obviously we have to support what is good, and we have to support our brothers and sisters there.
Yeah, and yes, and I feel like also what you said earlier, Granville, why now is this happening? I was feeling that and thinking it was probably because there's just the sway of the Iranian government's like how do I put this? I feel like some of these things have kept in place, like the government's power. Part of it is maybe the authority of religion and people's own beliefs, maybe, and enforcement of those beliefs. And maybe those beliefs have liberalized over time. and that's definitely coming down. And it's interesting that the focal point of it was really, of the protests, has begun with the hijab thing and people controlling you and trying to say, you know, we're going to like impose certain religious beliefs on you, and people are saying no. But that's like the heart of what the government's doing, which is control. And I think the other thing that's falling away is, I think the Iranian government that they have today, it comes from a like an anti-Western thing, like a backlash against like the West, and saying like we stand for, you know, I don't know, Islamic values. And you know, the revolution was all about, in Iran, was all about like rising up against the oppression of the Shah of Iran. And the US government like helped, through the CIA, they helped the Shah come into power, and they helped the overthrow of the democratically elected, you know, president of Iran before then. But you can't say the US just did it, because the Iranian people and Iranian society chose that, you know, obviously. But that happened, and then the revolution was like the counter against that. So saying like, oh, these are your enemies, you know, the West is opposing you, stand for our values, you know, creating this like us versus them, very strong, stark separation. And the government saying, you know, everyone is to follow what we say, and, you know, there is no dissent allowed because we have this enemy. And I feel like that sense of we have this enemy and we are threatened, and, you know, everyone must, you know, like follow what we say, has just gone down over the years, and people just don't believe it. They don't buy into it. So many people have left Iran to be in other countries and to be in the West and to seek greater freedom. And I feel like that's all the BS is just kind of really filtered out, especially with the advent of the internet. So I feel like that might be what it is. Not only that, but like now, like all the pressure on the pressure that has been on Iran with all the sanctions, the isolation, and the economy being in a bad place, I think it all contributes to people just saying, yeah, you know what, there's no reason, we're not going to like tolerate this anymore. So, which is interesting because in Russia, they have the same thing going on. So I thought that was a good connection, because Putin always blames the West and always says like, this is America's fault, this is the West's fault. Unfortunately, follow what I say and we will prevail over our great enemy. You know, so that could be maybe a segue into our next, unless you guys have any thoughts on the Iran topic.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, and we do need to be very aware of the fact that there's definitely a deeper desire for freedom amongst people. And one of the things that stood out to me in reading those articles was just that it sounds like a lot of these protests are much more initiated by younger generations in those countries, for the reason that the way of life that was popular before is no longer sustainable. It's not accepted as a healthy way of living their lives, and just even being allowed to be human. And so we do need to be aware that for me, the underlying thing is, yes, there's a choice to stand in their power and their freedom and take back their freedom. But I think the stronger desire is to have a much healthier relationship with life. And that cannot happen if your life is being dictated by state in one way or another. So I think the incidence of protest might actually increase as the desire grows, and we've seen it across various spaces with some of this economic pressure. We saw it with the Sri Lankan protests. We are now seeing it again, as you say, Sage, with what's happening within Russia, and the conscriptions and how people are starting to protest the war that is literally starting to seem as if it hasn't been supported for a while. So I do believe that there's a stronger desire about amongst more people to have a better relationship with life for themselves, and that the instruments of state or anything else that tend to get in the way of it are going to see significant amounts of protest as we go forward.
You know, at the very beginning, sorry, Sage, at the very beginning of our conversation, Jeff said, like, at the core of it, people want peace. Otherwise, life on Earth wouldn't be sustainable if we didn't want peace, you know? And today I was watching a class from Twin Flame Ascension School where Shaleia was talking about attachment to her exes, but not in a romantic way. She was saying, sometimes I follow one of my ex and I was very, very angry and blaming him, and I didn't understand why. And I was attached to him basically because attachment just means like having some type of emotion. And now I don't feel anything. But I had to learn to let go of that and really take responsibility for myself and for my healing. And, you know, being truly detached is not trying to separate. I acknowledge that he was in my life. I just don't feel anything about it anymore. But it doesn't mean that I erased him, you know. And, you know, that was very telling for me because we've associated the way Russia treats everyone to an abusive relationship many, many times. And also like the way like Sage was talking about the fact that some governments are blaming the West for the problem is like the demonstration that holding some type of anger there is just going to be detrimental and cause harm to people if you don't heal it. Like if you let that resentment simmer, like it's like a disease that needs to be healed. And what the people are showing with protests, like wherever they are and whatever the protest is about, is that they don't stand with like a resentment and the harm that comes with it. And I think maybe that's why younger generations are taking so much place in this, is because they're like, dude, like, chill out, we don't care, we just want to live in peace, you know? And that's not the way. And we're trying to show you something because there are people that they should be listened to. That's what a government should be about. And so it's basically about healing the sickness of governments because they're not doing their job and they're also not respecting the wishes of their people. And so there's a whole lot of things that we can compare to relationships there and to healing. And I think it helps us put in perspective that, you know, even if you hold like just a cyclist of resentment, it can have a big impact. And maybe you're trying to cover it with like defending yourself from others and NATO, or having a government that is more respectful of your religion. But like the people know when it's just excuses and that it shouldn't be done. Like the energy is felt, and so you should always like have it as your compass to see the world and also to be a leader. At least that's what I think.
Yeah, yeah, I know. I wanted to say that, like, you know, with Russia and all the protests about the mobilization that Putin has started, I feel like it shows that people don't really buy into his narrative about Russia being attacked, threatened by the West, and persecuted. And that's the whole thing is saying that, the West, I don't know, just that the West is threatening them and wants to dominate them in the world. And that Russian speakers all around the world where they are, I guess mainly in the former Soviet Union, are like being threatened. And that's why they need to intervene in Ukraine. I feel like people don't really buy into that to the extent that they might have used to, if they even ever did, because of the fact that there are no Nazis coming into Russia. Like, there are no Nazis marching in from Ukraine and coming in to invade. Like, there is no existential threat to Russia, but Russian leaders have always called upon this existential threat to Russia, and Putin is not an exception. And that just doesn't exist. People are like, this, there is none. But Putin is saying that Ukraine, with its Jewish president, is a Nazi regime. And he's been saying that, all this time. And I feel like people, as much as people might report on surveys to support the war, at least somewhat, which those might not even be reliable, I think that now that Putin is upping the ante and saying, like, I'm going to start, calling people up to serve when they previously hadn't even wanted to. Like, I feel like that's when you up the ante and people start to really question, okay, what are my beliefs? Do I believe this narrative? Do I not? Do I want to go fight and die in this war that is obviously going badly because he said it would be quick? And now, like 7 months later, he's like calling people up to join because we're running out of people. I think that's when people start to question the beliefs about it. And yeah, what do you guys think about it? I feel like that's what it may be showing.
I felt like Isaiah wanted to say something, but no, okay.
Or, yeah, I don't know. Do you agree? Do you think that Ukraine may secretly be a Nazi regime? The Jewish leader is just a cover up. It's just a cover up. I'm just kidding. I just wanted to, throw that out there.
Yeah, I feel like as any persecution of Jewish people or any persecution whatsoever, it doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't add up at all. So yeah, I don't even have thoughts about that. And maybe people needed to be woken up with like a move like that to say, like, okay, am I anti or am I supporting this? And I think also, like, there's a deeper core to it. Is like, at the beginning of this war, we were having like analysis of the Russian people and how they worked, and basically they're complacent to an extent, and what we should not touch, like what the government should not touch if they want the people to remain in agreement and being complacent, is the family. Because like with the civil war is in crisis and a government change, like that's something that they don't want at all. Like, they don't want losses again, like to start over again, and they don't want that pain. And so some people thought that just the fact of having like soldiers, like established soldiers, being killed would like wake up some people, but maybe like it's that drafting military draft would be the wake-up call for some people. And yeah, I don't know how it's gonna go. Because I feel like we still don't know like where Russian people stand if they have made their choice just yet, you know. But I think like as anyone else on earth, they're being pushed to grow in a sense. And the universe is like, all right, well, will you choose? And we all have to make these choices. And I think it's varies right now. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with you, like the family, you know, Putin trying to hit the family in Russia, it's such a huge deal because like, and you know, in Russia, the government has really, as a strategic move to, well, to commemorate World War II, because it was a massive loss for Russia. It was like, I think Russian losses were just the highest out of any country, period, in World War II. And the government has used that as like a way to, I don't know, rally people behind the government and for national pride, you know, their victory in World War II and everything. But besides there being the victory, there's also the trauma of it, the scars of it. Like it's not recovered from it yet. Like those scars are still there. Russian society was just so like hammered by it that there was like a huge, fairly large gap between like, well, nowadays, like there's still a large gap between like old women and old men. That there are so many more like older women than there are like old men, because so many men died in the war, and there continues to be also like a huge difference between life expectancy between men and women too, which I feel like could even be like a continuation of that trauma, you know, because there's a lot of like alcohol abuse and such. Maybe it might be like numbing out to that, but the fact is basically that I feel like Russians, a lot of them like aren't prepared to like lose more of their men basically to like another war. And they don't want a repeat of World War II, and they're aware that this isn't a repeat of World War II and that that's not needed. Yeah, so I think it's kind of like since there's that unaddressed like trauma, or and people remember that, it's just like, yeah, we don't want any more of that, you know, and we know this is not World War II again, and no.
So I have a very alternative take on this whole thing. And I think one of the things that stands out for me is just the desperate measures being implemented in terms of supporting the war effort. So one of the things for me is when you get to a place where you are drafting citizens to participate in a war, that means you're running out of soldiers yourself. And by intents and by any purpose, as far as I understand it, Russia has quite a strong military presence. So the fact that they are now actually drafting citizens into this war tells me that there have been losses, and probably quite significant losses, which also starts to make me wonder, well, it also makes me wonder how well supported this effort was, because there may have been losses in the sense that there's deaths, or there may have been losses in the sense that there's desertions because soldiers no longer support the war. So as opposed to doing their military duty, they are going AWOL and all those other weird and wonderful things, which means we have to bolster numbers. So there's that sense on one front. There's the other sense that if you have to draft people, that means there's not necessarily people signing up to the military.
Yeah.
which means that there's not necessarily as much support as you would have liked us, as you would have liked to lead us to believe you had in the first place. So again, that military propaganda that we have a strong military becomes questionable. Then you have then there's the measure of foreign soldiers serving in the Russian military who now no longer have to provide proof of residence in order to apply for permanent citizenship. Whereas before that was very strictly enforced. Tells me that the efforts to bring people into the military and people serving in the military are reducing. Or they're not as effective as what you would like us to believe. Again, very much a desperate measure to bolster numbers because you don't have the support that you would like us to believe. Like all of these things for me just speak to a narrative that's falling apart. And in that falling apart narrative, we have to solve it in some way. And we also know typically that the Russian propaganda narrative will deflect from what is the truth at certain points. And in this case, the truth can no longer be hidden for very long if we're starting to implement these kind of desperate measures to bolster our military numbers. There's obviously something else going on here. There's obviously something that says the Russian people may not have supported this effort as much as we would have been led to believe that they have. And so we have to force them into military service because it sounds like a lot of force. Like a lot of the draft has been shrouded by changing laws that criminalize not showing up for military service when you have been drafted. So there's a lot of strong arming that tells me force is being applied in a space where there is no other support. So I feel like we need to be very clear or just even aware that there's more at play here than what we are being shown, and that it is important to understand what those things could mean for this effort. So, I mean, in the past week, in the past conversation, we saw the significant losses that Russia is experiencing on certain fronts in this Ukraine war. Now we're seeing them trying to bolster their numbers, which just tells me there's less support. The losses are becoming more. There's more desperate maneuvering to appear to still be in a position of power in this war. And I think we need to be very clear that something else is afoot, and there might be, again, change quite quickly, because it seems like change is once again the theme across the 2 weeks of the conversation.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds too, you know. Yeah, and I think some of the protests too are also even about, for those who are aware, they are about awareness of like Russia, well, basically like reviving like colonialism. And some people were protesting and just saying like no genocide, you know, meaning like they're aware that this is a war of, it's kind of like, yeah, a war of like domination, you know, of another people. And that is, you know, I don't know, it's a good sign for the Russian resistance, I guess, and the awareness of people that, you know, what the war is actually about, essentially. And yeah, it shows that obviously, you know, the government's efforts at censorship and to push their narrative like isn't working because it's not strong, because it's not aligned with the truth, you know.
In a sense, that's reassuring to know that people are aware enough that we're even hearing about this protest, because I think what is prevalent in these parts of the world right now is that it's so closed off. They even have their own internet and social media sometimes that we don't know what is going on. And so to have this, you know, this force rising against the government, and that we're hearing about it is very good. And yeah, maybe I want to draw a comparison, like jumping off on what Brendel said. You know, France had a war with Algeria in the 50s, and even though they were said to be to have the upper hand and the best military, and that the war would be quick, it wasn't. And that's when they got desperate and they started drafting people and sending them to war. And it was obligatory, like you couldn't escape basically the drafting when you were called to. And basically, there were huge losses on both sides. And I don't want to go into too much details about it, but like the parallels between the two are very, very they were jumping at me, basically, especially when Sage talked about Russian people calling out colonialism, neocolonialism there. And yeah, I think whatever we were trying to understand about the world, like it wasn't so long ago that there were all these wars. And I think we can take from it to try to understand what is going on. And like, hopefully it means that for Russia, it's going to be like, they're talking about doubling down, but with like the lack of resources, like it might be the end. We don't know, maybe it will be in a year, but it gives hope that there is like a win there, a win of love and not of you know, genocide or like crimes against humanity or something, you know.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. On that note, I'm going to say it is our hour. So thank you to everybody for the conversation. Thank you to everybody that's followed us. Please feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel, where you'll find all our previous conversations. And we look forward to seeing all of you again next week. So thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.